teaching elders. So Lisa Allgood is the Transitional Executive in the Presbytery of Cincinnati. And Lisa, I welcome you. I'd love for you to just share a little bit about your background, because you've got one of the most interesting backgrounds of anybody I've ever met. And it's like, wow. So welcome, and we're glad that you're with us today.
Thank you, Darius. Thank you for having me. I am an Immuno Cyto Chemist by training. I graduated from the University of Medicine and Dentistry, New Jersey back in 1985 and started in the pharmaceutical industry. I spent 36 years in 3 different companies running primarily clinical studies, first dose to man, medicines to man, and also working with regulatory boards of health around the world, the FDAs on 5 continents. But I started in the immunology lab. I ran a group called flow cytometry for Merck Sharp and Dohme back in New Jersey. I grew up in the New York City area. And some of the first work I did were on 2 different viruses. One is rhinovirus, the virus that causes a cold. There are various types of those, but also one back then that was called HTLV4, which eventually became known as HIV. So that's my sort of virology background. The fact that I am now the executive presbyter in Cincinnati is a proof positive of God's sense of humor, that he would put an immunologist in as presbyter during a pandemic. And I was only supposed to be here 3 months. I was only supposed to be here to keep the lights on while a search was done for, I will say, a real presbyter. And 18 months later, I'm still here. So we'll just see where God is going to take this. And I'm perfectly willing to go along for the ride. But Darius had asked me to talk a little bit with you about coronavirus. He sent some questions in advance, and I've done a little bit of background work on what South Florida looks like today. So I'm going to take you through a very quick, and I apologize for the rapidity of the information. It is overwhelming, but there are other videos, and I know this one is being recorded, so you can go back and listen. And I'm also happy to take questions if you want to email later. I'm perfectly happy to give whatever resources I can. So coronavirus is not unusual. There are actually 7 different types of coronavirus. 4 of them cause common cold, just like the rhinovirus does. And they're pretty benign. We've had 2 other pandemics with coronavirus types. One was SARS that came out of Singapore. The other was MERS that came out of the Middle East. Both of those were more deadly than the current coronavirus that we've got, but far less infectious. And so those pandemics, if you will, sort of petered out much faster than this one will. This one is a nasty little virus, and I will just say that up front. This is not a virus you want to mess with. And as I go through some of the symptoms and some of the fatality rates and the sequelae, you'll understand why. This coronavirus is about 3 times more infectious than any other respiratory virus. It is airborne. There are some surface transmissions, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but really this is a virus that is breathed in. And it's spread way faster in the United States than anywhere else. Our infection rate in the United States is about 15 times that of any other country in the world. We have not got this under control, not in any way, shape, or form. Part of what makes this virus a little scary is the way that it spreads. So you've heard probably some of these, that 40% of the people who are actually infected with the virus have no symptoms. They are asymptomatic. And so you don't always know who you're sitting across and whether or not they are infectious. Just about 2 weeks ago, another piece of data emerged. We had been saying that people who will develop symptoms are infectious for 2 days before the symptoms develop. It turns out that people can be infectious for up to 8 days before they develop symptoms. So again, even those who have symptoms have a longer and more highly infectious period before those symptoms even develop, and you don't know because they're not exhibiting symptoms, they've not yet been tested. Just 2 days ago, another piece of data came out that may actually explain why the community spread in the United States has been so high. And it's this: young children have 25 times more virus in their airways than adults who are hospitalized. And children rarely develop symptoms. Only those who have pre-existing medical conditions or severe asthma really develop symptoms of any kind. So it turns out that probably young children are our biggest vectors in our society. Most of the community spread that you're seeing now is not, it's not protests, it's not in the hospitals, although there are hotspots certainly in hospitals and nursing homes and prisons. Most of it is through community spread, small weddings, small bridal showers or baby showers, 4th of July backyard barbecues, and you're going to start to see it in the schools. Of the 15 colleges that I've been following, and 3 of them are here in Cincinnati, they've already had hotspots. Kids are partying, the dorms have had hotspots, individual classrooms have shown hotspots, and so this is a highly, highly infectious virus, not one to mess with. The other sort of quirky part of this, and we've heard about 6 feet of separation, right? There are 2 factors that will indicate how likely it is you will be infected: the number of virus particles you're exposed to, but also the length of time that you're exposed to those virus particles. It turns out for this virus, because it is so infectious, that you only have to be in front of someone for 15 minutes before you have hit the peak of the potential to be infected. So if you think about being back in a sanctuary, even for 30 minutes, you have been infected at the maximum point at 15 minutes in, at halfway through. So again, definitely not a virus to mess with. As of yesterday, we had about 23 million infected globally. We have about 6 million infected in the United States. That's about a quarter, more than a quarter. Just not a great situation. In terms of symptoms, the symptoms are long lasting. Again, unlike any virus that I've ever seen, that is not a virus that stays in your body. We're not sure what COVID does. We don't know if it's going to become latent. So if you think about chickenpox that stays in your body after you've been infected and reemerges later as shingles, it's entirely possible that coronavirus could be the same. It's also not known whether once you've had coronavirus and you've recovered essentially, whether or not you can be reinfected. The immune response to this virus is weak and very short-lived. And just this morning, the Journal of American Medical Association came out with a study that said they really cannot correlate antibody titer, whether you've got antibodies in your system, with any measure of recovery with any degree of certainty. They just do not correlate. So the initial symptoms tend to be those that you've heard: fatigue, anything that sounds like a normal flu, fatigue, chest pain, joint pain, shortness of breath, fever, cough. But there's also cognitive dysfunction rather. There's a loss of taste, a loss of smell that indicates the virus is getting into the central nervous system, and we'll talk about that again. This can lead to, particularly in the elderly and people with underlying medical condition, acute respiratory failure, a cytokine storm, which is a hyperimmune response, and there are reasons for certain individuals having a hyperimmune response to this virus. That actually can cause sepsis and multiple organ system shutdown. One of the scary things that this virus does is it causes clots in the small blood vessels, which means it leads to stroke. It leads to permanent neurological dysfunction. It can lead to multiple organ failure. So I know I'm being scary, but there's a reason to be scary. The fatality rate for this virus is actually not high. It's only 1%, but I say 1% guardedly because that's still a lot of people. That's 10 times more than a general flu. It's about 5 times less than something like Ebola. Ebola now has a vaccine. HIV does not have a vaccine, but it has a number of very good treatments, and so those fatality rates have actually come down over time. While fatality is low, morbidity is very, very high. So with every one fatality, another 19 people will be hospitalized for long-term, and many of those will be on ventilators. Another 18 people will suffer permanent or long-term cardiac damage. This virus has been shown to get into heart muscle, and that, in conjunction with a shutdown of blood to the heart, can lead to significant damage. For every 1 death, there will be 10 permanent lung damage. I've seen CAT scans of young cross-country female runners, probably some of the generally most healthy lungs you'll ever see, and there is permanent scarring in the base of the lung because of the fluid that's been there. For every 1 death, there will be 3 strokes. For every 1 death, there will be 2 permanent neurological dysfunction. And for every 1 death, there'll be 2 permanent cognitive dysfunction. So again, the sequelae of these viruses and the long-term significance of these is not to be underestimated. One of the studies just recently was published said that 2 months after hospitalization, only 12% of the people who are released are symptom-free. And so you will see they're called the long haulers, the people who have everything from increased hair loss, which I have to confess, nobody understands why that is, but continued shortness of breath, continued fatigue, continued cognitive dysfunction. We're seeing hotspots come up again around the world. So it's not just the United States right now. France, Spain, Italy, Germany, the UK, New Zealand, who thought they'd eradicated the virus, Israel, South Korea, Poland are all experiencing spikes again. So this virus is not going away globally either. Treatment is actually proving to be quite difficult. So all of the original tests that were done with products that are used to treat flu failed. They do not work in the coronavirus. The only two things that have been shown to work, and just yesterday another study came out that questioned the first one, is something called remdesivir, which is an antiviral, and then dexamethasone. When this infection starts, the trick of treatment is to try to reduce the number of replications of the virus in the body. And so an antiviral like remdesivir will help that. It actually helps prevent the virus from attaching into a cell so that it gets into the cell and can replicate. And there were early studies that said it was actually reducing hospital stays by 4 days or so. That's actually pretty significant for this disease. Later in the immune response to this virus, because there is a tendency to have the immune system over-respond, you actually want an immunosuppressant. You want to reduce the amount of the immune response to make it just the right amount. It's a little bit like a Goldilocks story. And that's what dexamethasone does. It is an immunosuppressant. That steroid actually helps. Anticoagulants also help so that we don't get as many clots. The other thing that has been shown to be very helpful is to put the patient in a prone position. So actually lay them on their stomach, because it actually takes the weight of the organs off the lungs. It allows the lungs to inflate a little bit more readily. It increases airflow throughout the lungs. It allows blood flow to the heart to be a little bit better regulated. And it actually then can reduce anything that the ventilator might create in terms of long-term lung damage. So a prone position is actually just a simple turn the patient over from their back to the front. Convalescent plasma has not been shown to be helpful. Early studies were hopeful that patients who had recovered where plasma could be taken, the antibodies in there were showing some promise. Right now, that's showing nothing. And again, the antibody study that came out yesterday morning that said they cannot correlate antibody titer with recovery in any way, shape, or form shows that these antibodies are not very, very strong, and they really don't last very long. The longest we've been able to find antibodies after a particularly nasty illness is 4 months. And after that, they seem to wane. So what does that mean for vaccination development? Well, right now, there are about 150 different vaccines in various testing stages. In clinical trials, there are 3 stages, 1, 2, and 3. The first one is very, very few patients to look at safety to make sure there's nothing overt that's going to happen. Phase 2 is about 100 patients to really look at what's the right dose, what's the additional safety signals that you want to look for. And then phase 3 is tens of thousands of patients to really look at efficacy and safety. There are 7 right now that are advancing into phase 3, all from major companies whose names you'd know. Back in March, the United States government started to seriously fund some of these companies in a project called Operation Warp Speed. It was done under the aegis of the National Institutes for Health and CDC. There were 5 companies in it, now there are 7. 2 of these vaccines are what's called messenger RNA vaccines. This virus is literally a sack of fat with protein spikes. You've all seen the scary pictures. Those protein spikes are what attaches to a cell that allows them to inject the genetic material into the cell so that it will program replication. That genetic material for this virus is messenger RNA. So what these 2 companies, it's Moderna out of Boston and Pfizer, both big companies in the United States, they've taken small snippets of the coronavirus mRNA that are not virulent. They don't cause disease, but they do cause infection. So you can basically infect a cell with a non-disease calling version of the mRNA. And that allows the immune system then to recognize it and produce antibodies and produce another kind of immune response to it, which we'll talk about in a second. The problem with the mRNA virus is that they've never been commercialized in the United States. There is not an approved mRNA vaccine available commercially. The other problem is it needs to be kept at about -70 degrees Fahrenheit. So it makes it very difficult to transport, very difficult to just store in a little clinic or a doctor's office. The other 5 vaccines that are in development, it's J&J, Sanofi, and GlaxoSmithKline have partnered together. AstraZeneca, which is actually out of the UK, is working with the University of Oxford. Novavax, and then Merck Sharp and Dohme, which was my first company, are all working with a very standard, very traditional vaccine development program. They take one of 2 different kinds of viruses, adenovirus or stomatitis virus. They attach to it the protein from the coronavirus. And then that's an attenuated virus, so it doesn't cause disease, but it is infectious. And that then allows the immune system to be primed against the protein on the coronavirus rather than the genetic material. That's a very standard way to make a virus. Standard way to make a vaccine. Every vaccine you've ever had is that kind of vaccine. Mumps, measles, rubella, the flu virus, anything like that, shingles virus, the HPV virus, or all that kind of technology. They are all also just about to enter or are in phase 3. The interesting issue is that the timing to get a vaccine to approval is honestly at this point going to depend on the number of volunteers to get into these clinical trials, because these do tend to take 30,000 people per. It's entirely likely we will have a vaccine or 1 or 2 vaccines in the first quarter of 2021. It's not likely that most of us on this call will get vaccinated until the 2nd or 3rd quarter of 2021, just because they have to make so much. And it's likely that the first responders, the medical personnel, hotspots, nursing homes will be the first to get the vaccine. That said, we're probably going to have several to choose from. It's also not known, because of the poor immunity naturally that we're beginning to see, at least in terms of antibody production. It's entirely possible that this is going to be a vaccine that requires boosters, so it won't just be a single shot. It's also likely at some point that it might be an annual vaccine. It might be one you get along with your annual flu shot. That said, please get your flu shot this year. You do not want to have to overwhelm the medical system with a lot of flu cases because you didn't want to get vaccinated. And anything at this point you can do to prime your immune system is a good thing. So I'm going to shake my finger at you. Make sure you all get your flu shots. That's pretty much the download at this point. I have looked at the South Florida counties, and I'll give you a website that you can look at. And what I've been telling the churches here is pick one website, and I'll give you a couple of examples, but this is the one I really recommend. And just use the data from one website. If you try to compare data across websites, you're going to end up confusing yourself, because they all report at different times. They're reporting from slightly different sources, and it's really hard to get them to match up. The one that I've been using is one called COVID Act Now. It's covidactnow.org. It actually, when you pull it up, it'll pull up a map of the country. You can click on your state, and then it will allow you to go county by county. What it does is it actually gives you a color coding, green, yellow, orange, red, on 5 different criteria, everything from the infectivity rate to the number of new cases, to the number of hospitalizations, to county by county ICU utilization. So how many ICU beds are there and how many are actually occupied, and then death rate. That's a great way to use 5 different objective medical and medical utilization measures to actually benchmark where you are. In Ohio, the state of Ohio has a similar system just for the state of Ohio. They actually do it across 7 measures. Of course, their colors are different, so I can't match them up. But I also have Kentucky and Indiana churches, and so we actually use COVID Act Now for those. But pick one and stick to it. So don't try and jump around a little bit. As I've looked at COVID Act Now for Florida, you have a significant number of new cases still on a day-to-day basis. That makes many of your counties in the red zone, or at least the orange zone. The infectivity number is going down. That means the virus is still spreading, but it's spreading more slowly. That's a good thing. And that's likely due to masking. Masks make a huge difference. And Darius, if you want, I'll send you a video that actually shows the value of a mask. Please, please, please wear your masks.
Wait, please do send that to us. And that first site you talked about, Lisa, that
Yes.
is on our website under
Perfect.
the Ministry Resources tab.
Good. Yeah. And it's a good one to use. It's actually, it tracks very well with CDC, which is the other website I use. You can also use the CDC website that will also give you county by county information. But COVID Act Now sort of puts it all into a nice package for you. The thing that I worry about actually in South Florida is your ICU bed utilization is very, very high. So that means if you get a spike, you're going to have a hard time really dealing with those who are seriously ill. And so again, mask, physically distance, all the things you've been heard, wash your hands, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means from a sanctuary standpoint in a second. This virus is not going to go away. This virus is one that we will likely be living with for a very, very long time. Vaccination is going to take care of part of it. I've had a lot of questions on herd immunity. Herd immunity is defined as 70% of the population has some degree of immunity, either on a short-term or a long-term basis. It's unlikely we're going to get to herd immunity on this in any time. Most of the vaccines that are under development are predicted to be effective in about 50% of the population at the first go. If we get multiple types of vaccinations, we might get there better. But if you look at what Sweden did, they actually, when this hit Europe, they tried to get to herd immunity by not masking, not putting out physical distancing guidelines, not allowing large gatherings, and they had the highest per capita death rate in all of Europe. So even their own medical system is saying that failed, and we're not going to be able to do that in the US. Going out and getting yourself infected may mean that you have long-term symptoms, but it also may mean that you're not completely protected. It's not like the immune response that you get is going to be very protective. That said, there is a different type of immunity that we haven't done a very good job of measuring. We tend to think only about antibody titer. And that's the cellular type of immune system that you have. There are two types of something called a T cell. It comes out of the thymus, that's why. And so the T cell response with both the vaccines and with the native viral infection has actually been fairly strong. That T cell response is actually what recognizes the virus when it comes back into the body and then primes the rest of the immune system to respond. So that's the other factor of immunity that we're actually now beginning to study, and that actually looks like it's a little bit more durable. The other part, though, that's a little scary, and I forgot to talk about this when I was talking about all of the other organ systems that are affected. We've now found in the last couple of weeks that it affects both the pancreas, which means it can cause diabetes, even in people who didn't really have a predefining diabetic potential. It's also now shown to get into the thyroid, which means it can affect your metabolism and your growth if you're a young person, and your body temperature regulation. So it just gets in everywhere. It's really scary. What else? Questions? I'm going to open it up. I know I'm a harbinger of joy in the morning after you've had such a beautiful worship.
Is there any, thank you, Lisa, so much for coming, and thank you so much. Is there any studies on those that get the virus but don't show any symptoms? I mean, is there a DNA pattern of that kind of person who is able to walk around with it and not get sick?
It's a really good question, and the answer is no, mostly because most of those people have not been tested. If you remember early on, we had so few test cases, and part of that was the reagent that was used in the test at that time wasn't available. They actually had to go make it. So no, the answer is no. We haven't actually studied them. I can tell you the medical community is confused. They don't know why children don't get symptoms the way they don't get symptoms. There's a lot of theories out there about their immune system isn't primed enough. It's primed just right. The adults that don't get it, they tend not to have underlying medical conditions. So that's part of it. They tend to be healthier. They tend to be younger, but that's not enough to explain it. And so some things have emerged. These are not things that will make you risk-free, but somehow they make the risk of infection and or really developing a medical condition on the back of infection reduced. And that, believe it or not, is blood type. That's not unusual. There are other viruses for which blood type can be somewhat protective. For this virus, if you have an O blood type, you're actually apparently better protected than if you have A or B. There are other viruses for which if you have A or B, you're better protected, and nobody knows why. So there's nothing that's been done genetically that says this genome protects you better than that genome. It tends to be general health and and some other stuff that we don't know. We really don't. I mean, we've only known about this virus literally for 9 months now. And we are learning every day.
A follow-up question?
Of course.
One of our musicians, the guitar player, more than a month and a half ago, was his roommate. One of his roommates was just, I don't know, exposed, had no symptoms, got tested. The other roommates didn't catch it, but our guitar player did. And he still is testing a month and a half later as positive, even though he still doesn't have any illness. So I tried to do some scientific research on it. And they said that there is a smaller viral load in those people that do not, because we were all around him doing worship. We weren't close by, but we were around him recording our worship, and nobody got it.
Yeah, so, you know, that it may be true that for certain individuals, there's a lessened viral load. Nobody knows why. But remember what I said about kids who don't get symptoms. They have 25 times the viral load that someone on a respirator in the hospital has. So viral load doesn't always correlate to symptoms. And the fact that, you know, the fact that he was asymptomatic just for him, if he had less virus in his system for whatever reason, remember I said your chances of getting infected are predicated on the amount of time you spend with that individual, as well as how many virus particles you've been exposed to. So I'm going to say you got lucky, because if he had a very big viral spread, especially if you're making music with him without a mask on, and we can talk about going back into the sanctuary and what I've been telling other presbyteries and my own presbytery now for 8 months, you got lucky. And that's not a risk I'd want to take.
Praise God.
Lisa, it's Don Atkins in Broward County, Palm Beach, Pompano. Two-part question. Could you talk to K through 12 schools returning to in-person? And secondly, we have a K through 8 school that's currently on virtual, and our school board is discussing if the day comes that we bring them back into the classroom, even though we're going to do masks, or we're planning for masks, there's a time when they have to eat when they take their masks off. So can you talk to both of those the more general about K through 12 and the taking off the masks to eat?
Yeah, I mean, again, some of this is going to be, this is just Lisa's opinion, and so there's not a lot of data, but I will tell you that state by state, governors are putting different ages on a mask mandate. Some of the states are saying 10 and above only, some are saying 5 and above. Based on the data that just came out 2 days ago, I would say every child gets masked. That would be first and foremost. And every child, as best as they possibly can, get socially distanced. There's a Christian school not too far from my house that my daughter went to. I was actually on their board of trustees for years, and they literally spent the summer creating plexiglass booths, if you will, for the kids. It's a smaller school, so they can actually do that. They are back in person. They've already had a case because none of these kids are isolated. So one of the CDC roundtables that happened a couple of weeks ago with physicians, the most impactful thing that was said that I came away with said, if you've been around 10 people and the 10 people you're with have each been around 10 people, then you've been around 100 people. None of us are completely isolated. So you can isolate a kid in a classroom, but they're going to go home to their family, and there's probably playmates at home at their neighborhood. And so you really can't control in any reasonable way what the infections are going to be like. And if you bring people together, and so this transmits also to churches, you raise the chances for infection as soon as you put them in an enclosed space. Children are particularly tough. They don't like the masks. I get it. I don't like them either. But you could put them out on a playground, and chances are pretty good those masks are going to come off. And chances are pretty good they're not going to know what 6 feet looks like. When we started back to worship, a couple of churches here in Cincinnati started back outside. They actually made sure that people understood children under 6 couldn't come because they don't understand that they can't run up and hug Uncle Bill. That's just not in their nature. So we actually sort of encouraged that the little ones would have to stay home. The other thing that little ones do is they touch. There are toys, there are books, there are manipulatives. That's how they learn. And I have huge heart for the American Pediatric Association, who has suggested children should go back to school just because of the socialization that they need and the community they need. But it's tough to keep the infection down. The virus has been shown to last about 3 to 4 days on an impermeable surface, so plastics, doorknobs, light switches, wooden pews, and about 1 to 2 days on a permeable surface, and anything that's paper-based. It's really hard to make sure that you're really cleaning a classroom when the kids are in there every day. Same is true with colleges. If you look at, again, the colleges and the way that classrooms are put together and the way dorms are secluded and the way that you can't really socially distance kids who believe they're invincible, you're going to get hot spots. So, you know, I think it's a tough decision. The kids should be back in school for their socialization. They learn better. Not all kids learn well by virtually, because everybody has a different learning style. But it's really tough to contain the infection when you've got people in a room. Does that answer both questions?
Yeah, but what about when it's time to eat lunch? You know, what do you do there?
So again, you distance as much as you possibly can. You make sure that they have their own lunch. You probably aren't selling lunches anymore. The best thing you can do is reduce the number of times people touch the same thing. So you don't want kids with trays taking food off of a counter. You probably brown bag it, bring their own lunch, keep them secluded. They can't sit with their classmates. They can't sit with their friends. Obviously, you've got to take the mask off. So even in a restaurant, I don't know what South Florida is doing, but here, all of the restaurants are socially distancing by at least 6 to 12 feet, and you're allowed to take your mask off only when you're seated. Once you get up to go anywhere or leave the building or go to the restroom, you must have the mask back on. And it would be the same in a lunchroom.
So, Lisa, I see that Barbara Overton has her hand raised, so I'd like to recognize Barbara.
Sure.
Hi, Lisa, this has been fascinating. Thank you for this information. You've kind of touched a little bit on this, but could you talk about the difference between indoors and outdoors and the impact of air conditioning and those filters that they're willing to sell you for like $3,000?
Yeah, let's talk about that, because I wouldn't recommend those. So the best thing you can do is, if possible, and I understand completely that South Florida is an air-conditioned state. I get that. Ohio's not quite that bad, although we've been hot. Outdoors is better because you've got natural airflow away from people. And so I want you to imagine with me that you've got people physically distanced and there's a single source of airflow. Once you get back into a building, think about what air conditioning does. And I've got the same questions here in Cincinnati, but I've got this awesome HEPA filter, or I've got a UV radiation and it cleans the air. Well, that's great for about the first 10 seconds that it leaves the unit, but think about what air conditioning does. It pushes down on the congregation and then circles around before it gets taken back up into a return and then goes back through the system again. Once you've got the air down and it's circling around, basically what you're circling around is exhaled, potentially infected air. That filter is not going to do anything once the air is down in the sanctuary. And so there's been a study out of Wuhan. There's also been, that was the original study. There's also now been 2 more in the United States in restaurants with no natural airflow and a closed space with an air conditioner. And you can map the one person who was infected and all of the people around that individual who also got infected because the air was circulating. Even the National Association, I can't remember the acronym, but it's the National Advocacy Group for Air Conditioning, HVAC units in the United States, has said air conditioning and COVID do not mix. That is not a good combination. And so what we've been telling people here, I have very few congregations that are back in the sanctuary. Most of them are outside. I have my churches that go all the way to the edge of Appalachia, so very tiny, very rural churches. I've got big urban churches, I've got big suburban churches, and I have little churches in Kentucky and Indiana as well. A lot of those are outside, as long as they can be. They're still socially distanced, they're still masked. The ones that have gone back inside are small, can socially distance, and can mask. And what we've told them is, if you need air conditioning, air condition the sanctuary for the couple of days before anybody goes in, and then turn it off for the 45 minutes that you're in there, because everybody's services are abbreviated now. So that at least the air is cool, but it's not circulating. You're not pushing it around people. And then as soon as they leave the sanctuary, put it back on, and that's fine. The same with UV. So the trick about UV radiation is that there are 4 different types. There's A, B, C, and D. each virus is subject is subject to being killed by one of those 4 types of UV. So if they're telling you, I've got a UVD light, it might or might not affect coronavirus. It might affect a different virus. The other thing, and again, it's that same dynamic. It's great for the time that it leaves that unit, but as soon as it goes down over people, it's not doing anything anymore. The other thing to remember is, and again, you're not going to be necessarily sitting under it, but UV radiation is what causes skin cancer. And so you've got to be a little careful of that too. You don't want to be irradiating your congregants. So it's, you know, it's a little bit disingenuous at this point, I think, to say that a filter will clear the air. If you're working in a small enclosed manufacturing space that requires sterility, that's different. That's not your sanctuary. The other question I get is, I'm going to preempt another question, is about singing. You know, everybody loves our Presbyterian hymns. Believe me, I'm a prenatal Presbyterian. I know them all by heart. However, singing is like a 4-minute sustained cough. And a cough travels at 40 miles, 50 miles an hour. A singing person, and again, Darius, I'll send you another video on this because there's some backlit studies that Yale did that shows how far particles go in a trained singer, or even somebody who's just belting out a hymn. And it's basically 18 to 24 feet. So 6 feet of separation is not enough to keep you from being infected if the person around you is singing without a mask. I can tell you singing with a mask is not easy, because every time you take that big breath, you're basically breathing in your mask. It's better than nothing. I've got churches here who are actually humming, which is better yet. Not perfect, but humming. And they're actually having a blast with it. They're having a lot of fun. So I've told churches here that singing is not a good idea. I've got one church that is singing, but they're masked. And the rest of them have stopped. They have, and even the church that's singing is only singing 1 or 2 verses of the hymn, so they're keeping that at bay. We also here in Cincinnati are blessed to have the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. So many of my churches have young opera students who come and sing for them. And what we've told them now is only 1 or 2, so not a choir. That's been proven over and over again to be a hot spot. Those young singers are masked for the entire service until they get up to sing. And when they get up to sing, they're 24 feet apart. We're all Presbyterians. Nobody sits in the front row. So we're usually 24 feet apart from the congregation as well. And they actually face slightly away from each other. And they sing a duet, and then they mask and they go back to their seat. And so we try everything we can to keep that any exhaled air from circulating in any way, shape, or form. I have some pastors who have a plexiglass screen now in front of their pulpit. That's great. Plexiglass screen actually protects you from mucus particles, but it doesn't protect you from circulating air because you're still breathing the air in. The same with a face shield. It's great to protect you from getting a mucus droplet in your eye and being infected that way, but you're still breathing the air underneath it. So if you look at the medical personnel in a hospital, they're wearing both. They're wearing both a face mask and the shield. And so the shield is not a substitute for a mask. And you can preach with a mask. I've proven that.
Lisa, I hope you'll just talk very specifically about worship and whether or not you believe churches should be open for in-person worship now. I'll tell you that I don't believe they should. We have a few that are. And I think it's going to be a while before churches can do that. And I think it's going to be quite a while. And I personally believe that churches should be putting in their plans now for how to do Advent and Christmas online.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think when you think about when vaccines are going to be widely available and the fact that we're about to go back into flu season, I don't know what flu season is like in Florida, but here in Ohio, it can be pretty bad. So we are going to not only have multiple respiratory infections running around that, at least at the outset, are going to be difficult to distinguish one from another. Obviously, the longer term sequelae of coronavirus is very different than natural flu. It's going to be a very tough season. And so I've got churches here who have said they're not even going to consider going back until after the first of the year. Some of the bigger churches on the coast, where I come from, New York City, Chicago, San Francisco, have said they're not going back until after Lent. And so actually here in the Presbytery of Cincinnati, we have 11 presbyteries. We are putting together Advent services, full Advent services by presbytery to offer out to the whole synod. both all 4 Advent Sundays, Christmas Eve, we're going to do a Blue Christmas, and we're going to put one together for the Sunday after Christmas as well, because we know it's unlikely that most of our churches will be back in service. And so, you know, do I think churches should be back? Almost every answer I give you is it depends. I've got big churches that can seat 500 that are right now worshiping 50, so physical distancing is pretty easy. You know, they're doing all the right things in terms of masking and not passing a collection plate. The collection plates are in the back so people can put stuff in it and it doesn't get passed around, doesn't get touched. They're using the little individual communion wafer and grape juice, which I know is horrible. It tastes terrible, but that person can pick it up at the back and then they're not multiple touching things. We've taken the Bibles and the hymnals out of the pews. Even if the virus only lasts 1 or 2 days on those surfaces, why risk it? Why have things that people can touch? So if they are using hymns or just printing out hymns so that people can read them, they're putting them in the back so people can pick them up as they go and take them home and throw them away. We've told churches to absolutely, as much as you can, limit the number of places in the building anybody can go. Most of the churches, and I've only got 10 out of 67 right now that are back inside. And they only open up the sanctuary. So everything else is pretty much off limits. There's no fellowship, there's nothing in the kitchen, there's no Sunday school, all of that is done virtually. If a church needs to use the bathrooms, actually what the one church who's doing that is done is they've marked off 6 feet in the hallway that leads to the bathrooms, and they allow one person in at a time. They actually have alcohol wipes in there because they had a medical supply contact. And so whoever goes in then wipes down anything they've touched with the alcohol wipe, and then the next person goes in. If you've got groups that are meeting in your building and you feel like it's important for you to get them back, Alcoholics Anonymous or Boy Scouts or whatever it is, try to restrict them as well to a single room so that you don't have multiple rooms that you've got to worry about over time. The question has come back to me, if the virus only lasts for 3 to 4 days on an impermeable surface, if I've got people back in the sanctuary and that's the only room they're in, and I just close it off for the rest of the week, is that good enough? And the answer is probably yes, but there are probably still surfaces you'd want to clean, doorknobs and anything that gets touched multiple times by multiple people. As much as you possibly can, if you've got sanctuaries where the window's open, or you can create a cross ventilation with a door open or something like that, you should be doing that. I actually had a conversation yesterday with Peaks and Plains out in Denver. And so they're actually considering how they can do that in the winter. And basically they said, everybody's got North Face, we'll bundle up and we'll keep the windows open and we'll heat in advance. But at some point you can't worship outside there. So everybody's doing something slightly different to keep it going. I think if you're anything like the churches that are here, the joyous part of this is that they're worshiping and witnessing to more people than would normally ever cross their threshold when they're doing it virtually. Or those who are doing it outside in their parking lots, they're witnessing to their neighbors. How cool is that? Most of the churches are flat to up in giving. I don't know if that's sustainable, but that's where they are now. And I think almost every church that is able to do some kind of virtual worship is learning that, you know what? That's witnessing too, and that's actually producing fruit in ways they never imagined. So most of the churches that are being able to do this are going to continue it, even when they're able to go back. And one of the things that we talked about in the Presbytery is as soon as that happens, as soon as you're going into a hybrid situation like that, worship, of course, and so thank you for the gentleman who did the sermon on worship is for God first. Worship is for God first. But then the secondary focus of your worship has got to be the people online. Because as soon as you make them feel like the kid you set to bed while the party's still going on downstairs, you're going to lose them. And so they are actually at this point in the pandemic doing the better Christian witness by staying home and keeping people safe. And so you want the people who are in the sanctuary to be witnesses to the fact that you're worshiping the triune God and you're really focusing as much on the people online as you are on the people in the pews. So it's been a really interesting way for us to turn around what is the focus of what we do. And we've actually started to talk about this time. This is a liminal space. It's that, that space between what we always did and what we're going to live into next. And we're taking that time to really explore that and say, what is the essence of worship? And what is it that we should let go of that we say we always did? And what is it that we're going to take into this new space that we're going? And it's, you know, that's what God has done with generations and generations of his people. I'm going to lead Abram to a new land that I haven't described for you. Trust me. That's pretty much where we are.
Thank you. Thank you. I see that Willie has his hand raised and then Kim. So Willie.
Sure.
Hi, Lisa. Good morning.
Good morning.
I didn't have anxiety before this morning, but now I have anxiety. Thank you. If you had the choice of actually going to a church, sitting down in a pew, or staying home, it sounds like, just to be safe, you would stay home.
I will. My answer might be a little bit different. I'm staying home as much as I can because that way I get to look at 20 different sermons instead of just going to one. So that's actually really fun for me as a presbyter. But I will also tell you that my pulpit supply tends to be an older population. And so at this point, I would prefer, even though I'm 63, I would prefer to be the one that's going in to supply a pulpit than sending any of my folks. So I am socially distancing, masked all the time, except when I'm up to preach, and going to as many churches right now as I can to support them. But if I were a congregant, while there's virtual worship available, I would do that. If I were a pastor, I would also make sure that I'm offering other ways to keep in touch, and also other ways to have a devotional life. I think one of the things that we've learned is that, although I love the idea of community, and we've obviously been teaching people that community is an important part of worship, we may also have taught them that the only way they can worship and the only way they can have a devotion is in a group, and that's not true. And so I think we've got to figure out what that balance looks like.
Yep. And the other thing I would tell you, Lisa, is we have a school, and then we have groups chomping at the bit to come back, and we're not really, after listening to you, what I'm going to suggest to our elders is not to have any outside groups at this point, because I don't think it's worth it. Obviously, finances, our school and the church finances are not, they weren't really, believe it or not, it's gonna be a surprise to you. I don't know how it works up there, but we didn't have extra money before this hit.
Yeah.
So we don't have extra money now. And I tell my people, we're one little speck of virus from closing everything down. And if that happens, then, I mean, obviously the kids don't have a place to go. The teachers don't have jobs. And then the church is in deep trouble. So our thing is to be cautious. And listening to you today, taking this seriously, but this is very, very serious thing that I think as a church, it's better. And believe, I'm an extrovert, Lisa. So this virus was made to just kill extroverts. It's doing a good job.
Yes, it is.
And so, but listening to you today, I'm more inclined not to meet, not to have groups, not to be careful, to have stuff in the parking lot and things like that. And here in Florida, you got to have air conditioning, but it is what it is. Thank you very much for your presentation today.
You're welcome. I will also send Darius. So Darius, you're going to get lots of love notes from me today. Right. A lot of our churches have put together a decision tree on when to go back, how to go back, how do you do that? And they're doing it on the back of either COVID Act Now or the Ohio system, one of the two. So it's color coded. And I've told sessions that here, at least, this is not a one and done decision. You're never going, over the next 8 to 9 months, you're not going to decide one time to go back and that's it. Chances are, if there's a spike, especially as the fall hits, you're going to have to close again. And so make sure that you have a really good communication plan, that you know how to get a hold of everybody, and you know what the decision is that you're going to make. And if you can, base it on those outside objective scientific medical things, as opposed to you've got somebody pounding on the table saying they have to go back. I mean, that said, and I don't mean to reverse what you just experienced, is that there are ways to do it. I mean, I think, again, if you have the space and you can distance and you can mask and you've got a session who's willing to police all of that, and you can clean and you don't sing and you have a 20-minute service and that's enough, there are ways to do it. So I wish you well. I know that's hard. And I'm an extrovert too, so I understand that as well.
And I think Kim has her hand raised, and then Linda. Kim.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lisa. I'm wondering if in your head you have a timeline of when you talked about the vaccines and when everyone might actually be able to be vaccinated. Do you have in your mind some kind of timeline of when everyone might be vaccinated? And I guess my question is, do you see, I guess congregations are coming and worshiping already and maybe at different points, but is there a time that you see it being more safe in terms of that first wave of vaccination or when everyone's vaccinated? I'd love a little bit of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I don't really have a good timeline, but I can tell you that every single one of those 7 big companies that I mentioned who are now in the process of testing their vaccine are also taking the financial risk of making the vaccine in advance. And so Pfizer and AstraZeneca and Novavax already have hundreds of millions of vaccines available. They're just not approved yet. And that's a huge risk for these pharmaceutical companies. I can also tell you that one of the other joys of this, honestly, when you're looking for joy as a scientist, I guess, is that this has really become open source data. And that's not something that the scientific community and the pharmaceutical industry generally does. That data tends to stay fairly close to the vest until they're ready to publish it. But that's not the case here. So, if this continues and if there are multiple vaccines that are eventually cleared, I think, assuming that some of them will require boosters and some of them are not, I mean, they're all not just for the US, also understanding that not everybody's ever going to be vaccinated. There are just too many people out there who still don't believe in vaccines, who are nervous about these not going through the right channels with FDA. And I can tell you they are. FDA is being very cautious. I would be looking at June, July next year. That's sort of my very high level predictive.
Thank you, Lisa. Linda.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi.
I'm ruling elder Linda McLeod from Trinity, Key West. I have been a victim of this virus, just getting over it. I have to be retested again. But my question is, I'm tearing down everything in my room right now as when I finish. But my worry is my children. I have my daughter and her 3 kids here with me, and I thank God for them being here. Their tests came out negative, and I don't know how I picked this up, as you say, in passing, and it was just like a cold coming on. I thought I was catching the flu or something. And I happened to have a doctor's appointment, and when he tested me and told me I was positive, so I was like, wanted to jump out my window some days, being locked up in my room. But my question is, what do I do now that I'm cleared, but not cleared because I have another test to go through? My surrounding with my children, I go outside in my backyard since I've been able to come out. But now I'm truly afraid of even being surrounded by anyone other than what's in my household. But then I'm afraid of something happening to my household.
Sure. So I think getting repeated tests is good. Depending on what the test is, it's not actually, if you keep testing positive for some reason, it's actually not known if you're still infectious. I mean, there really is a lot that's not known about this virus. It's possible that these tests are picking up fragments of the mRNA, and that makes the test positive, even though you're not actively infective anymore. I think the best thing you can do, particularly if you've got little ones, is, as much as you possibly can, you be masked all the time. Even in the house, which is not a whole lot of fun. If your daughter can be masked, as much as possible to try and model that to the kids, And if, you know, I don't know how old the children are, but if they can be masked as well, at least until you think you're out of the woods. It's not known if you can be reinfected. It's not, I don't know if your children and your grandchildren have been tested as well. The antibody tests to see if you've had the virus are not particularly good. They're not very reliable. And it's, again, it's not known whether, even if you've got the antibodies, if that means anything. It doesn't necessarily mean you're immune. And so just as much caution as you possibly can. I think if you've got underlying medical conditions, and depending on your age, if you can stay in as much as possible, that's good. If you can just, even if you're going to get outside and take a walk, I would even mask then for you. And I walk my dog 3 miles every morning. I don't mask. I walk at 5 in the morning. There's not too many people out there. But if you're passing people on a sidewalk, chances are you're not with them long enough to infect them or get infected. Does that help?
Yes, it helps. And we do wear the mask. I'm in my room right now, so of course I don't have it on. But we do wear the mask, and they have been tested, and their tests came back negative, thank God.
Good. Oh, well, and praise God for your recovery. That's a good thing. So I'm going to keep praying for you. Yes.
Thank you.
Well, Lisa, I just want to thank you so much for being with us today. This has just been great. And I look forward to all that good stuff you're going to send me, and I will share it widely among the Presbytery.
Good.
You know, one of the things that I just really keep saying is that we're in this for the long haul. This is not going to be done tomorrow. And this is, as you say, it's not a one and done decision. We're going to have to keep revisiting this over and over again. And I'm just thankful for the way in which people are working together and experimenting with new forms of worship and doing incredible ministry that a year ago we never would have imagined we'd be doing. And so
absolutely,
as a bright time for the church.
I agree. I think we are reforming, truly reforming. And so I think that's a good thing.
Amen. So Lisa, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. You all stay safe and be blessed.
We are all applauding you, and blessings in your ministry.
Thank you. I'll talk to you soon.
Very good.